Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Guitar King Michael Bloomfield's Life in the Blues by David Dann. Narrated by Michael Butler Murray. View from the guitarist, the audience glistens a strange love, listens to the old voices in the season to be released from disease and freedom. Roy Landis Ruby. Come to this. Prologue. Bob Dylan stared at the menu, trying to make sense of it. There were a few odd French entrees, but the specialty of the house seemed to be peanut butter sandwiches, served under glass bells, flaming. He looked up at the waiter, then at the bill of fare, then back at the waiter. I guess I'll just have coffee," he said. "Un café," the man said flatly. He turned and disappeared through a side door. The folk singer looked around the room. Though thick drapes hung over its floor-length windows, there was enough afternoon light coming in to show paint peeling in places on the walls. An ornate rosette on the ceiling was stained with water spots, and there were wide swaths in the carpet that years of traffic had worn nearly bare. A musty odor pervaded, suggesting glories that had long since faded. It was the room's funereal silence, though, that spoke most prominently of decay. It was a silence that was suddenly broken. Startled, Dylan turned to see a young man with a guitar case standing in the hallway. He was loudly arguing with the maitre d'. "No, man, no, we don't want a table," he said, talking fast. "We don't want to eat. I'm looking for the folk singer, the guy who's working here. That guy." He pointed to a chalkboard on an easel in the archway. "Welcome to the Bear, a different kind of nightclub. Presenting gospel great Bessie Griffin and the Gospel Pearls. Plus, one night only. Special guest star Bob Dylan." "I just want to talk to this Dylan guy," the man continued. "You know where he is?" "That's me," Bob said quietly. The man in the doorway turned, stared for a moment, and then smiled. "Oh yeah, that is you," he said affably. "Nice to meet you. I'm Mike Bloomfield. This is Susie, my wife." Dylan stood as the couple entered the room. Though the man was tall, he walked with a peculiar stoop and took great splayed strides. What was most striking about him was his giant beehive of unruly black hair. His wife, by contrast, was a petite woman, an attractive blonde with a dimpled smile. "Yeah, hi, I'm Bob," Dylan replied. He gestured to the empty chairs at the table. "What can I do for you?" "Well, I'll tell you now. I heard you're a real hot guitar player," Bloomfield began, leaning the case up against the table and pulling out a chair. "I thought maybe we could play a little, you know? Jam or something." Well," Bob stammered. "I don't know. I mean, I've got to play tonight, and I'm really more a poet than a guitar player." "We got your album," Susie interrupted. "You played guitar on that. Blind Lemon Jefferson, Bucka White, Jesse Fuller. You played blues tunes by them." "Yeah," said Michael. "The back of the record says you're one of the best white blues players ever to be recorded. I would sure like to hear you play some blues." He smiled broadly and leaned in for the kill. "I mean, I've been hanging out with my friend Big Joe, and he's a pretty good blues picker. But you're the best. Hell, man, I'd really like to hear that." "Big Joe?" Dylan said quietly. "You mean Big Joe Williams? Well, I recorded with him, but that was on harmonica." "You recorded?" Bloomfield suddenly sat back. He looked at Susie and then at his host. "You know Big Joe. Baby, Please Don't Go? That Big Joe?" "Yeah," said Bob. "I met him in New York. We shared a bottle of schnapps and made a record. But I'm not much of a harp player either." Dylan smiled at the couple, and for a moment no one said anything. Then all three burst out laughing. "Man, you know Big Joe," Michael said chortling. "I'll bet you know now never to have a drink with him. So who else do you know?" By the time Dylan's coffee arrived, the folk singer and his two guests were in the midst of a private hootenanny. Bloomfield had his guitar out and was running through a few numbers by Big Joe. Bob was improvising comic verses, trying to follow along on his guitar, while Susan sang harmony. All three laughed and joked as Michael moved on to Blues by Reverend Gary Davis. Son House, Tampa Red, and Big Bill Brunsey. Soon they were singing Woody Guthrie songs, recreating Hollers by Leadbelly, and picking country ballads by Hank Williams. It seemed that Dylan knew every song Bloomfield could name, and that Michael could play every style Bob could name. An hour flew by, and then another. And by the time Dylan had to prepare for the evening's performance, he and Michael Bloomfield were rocking through tunes by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and the King, Elvis Presley. "Hell, man," Bob said to his new friend as he stood up, "you are just about the best damn guitar player I have ever heard." Though the foregoing scenario is a dramatization, the basic facts surrounding Michael Bloomfield's first encounter with Bob Dylan are not fiction. When Bloomfield went down to the Bear on Ontario Street on Thursday, May 2nd, 1963, he fully intended to cut one of the rising stars of the New York folk revival. Dylan was just about to release his second album on Columbia, to great critical acclaim, but Bloomfield couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. He had heard the folk singer's debut recording and found it laughable. The man couldn't sing, and he couldn't play guitar. Time to teach this upstart a lesson, Michael thought. As one of Chicago's finest young guitarists, someone who'd played with Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and countless other blues masters, as well as Big Joe Williams, Bloomfield knew he had the bona fides to do it. It was opening week for the Bear, a nightclub in a rundown Chicago mansion that had formerly been a French restaurant called L'Aiglon. A warren of dusty Victorian rooms, the venue offered its patrons weirdness accompanied by holy rollers, sexologists, and occasionally musicians, and was described as the dream residence of a Charles Addams couple. The creation of Second City founder Howard Alk, the Bear featured an eclectic roster of entertainment that first week, with gospel singer Bessie Griffin headlining. Dylan was included in the Thursday night show because his manager, Albert Grossman, was the club's primary investor. He hoped the folk singer would attract an audience. He did attract Mike Bloomfield, and two things happened when Bloomfield found Dylan in one of the club's dingy dining rooms. First, Michael was completely disarmed by Bob's affability. The folk singer's quiet charm, quick wit, and self-effacing modesty easily won Bloomfield over. Any desire to humiliate the folk star was forgotten. The two became fast friends, and remained so throughout Michael's life. The second thing that happened was that Bob Dylan, who would become one of the great influences on American pop culture in a career spanning more than half a century, encountered a guitar player whose virtuosity astonished him. Michael Bloomfield's intelligence, knowledge of music, and mastery of its many styles made a powerful and lasting impression. In a few years, Bloomfield would help Dylan reshape his own music, leading to a pop revolution that would define much of the music of the 1960s and 1970s. Nearly 5 decades after they first met, Bob was still in awe of his friend's artistry. He could just flat-out play. He had so much soul, and he knew all the styles, and he could play them so incredibly well, Dylan told Rolling Stone. Bloomfield was the one guitarist who, for Bob Dylan, set the standard for all the others. Michael was the one he never forgot. Today, though, many people seem to have forgotten Mike Bloomfield. It wasn't always so. Bloomfield was a big star in his day, for a brief period the biggest when it came to electric guitar. Everyone from folk diva Joan Baez to rhythm and blues, R&B rocker Mitch Ryder to jazz trumpeter Don Ellis wanted to work with him. But then Eric Clapton crossed the Atlantic with Cream, and Jimi Hendrix's Wild Thing ignited Monterey, and every other week it seemed like there was another hot guitar player grabbing music headlines. That was when Bloomfield decided he had had enough. As he later said, "I didn't relate to being a rock star at all." He dropped off the scene, played locally, and toured only when he needed cash. Popular music, preoccupied with stardom, moved on, becoming a massive and influential industry, capable of manufacturing rock stars the way Detroit stamps out cars for each new model year. Record companies quickly forgot about Michael Bloomfield, as did the pop media, the critics, and many of the guitarist's fans and followers. Not long after his death in 1981, Bloomfield had been relegated to footnote status, the guy who accompanied Bob Dylan when Dylan plugged in at Newport. But Dylan knew how important Mike Bloomfield had been to the development and expansion of American popular music at a time when Top 40 radio was preoccupied with British invaders, surfer dudes, and lemon twisters. Michael was not only a startlingly original and brilliant player, but also pivotal in introducing a generation to the blues and to those masters who originated it. He helped create folk rock, inspired the psychedelic rock craze, was the first to experiment with brass rock, and arguably laid the groundwork for jazz fusion. His influence unquestionably affected the direction popular music took in the 1960s. But following his death in 1981, that fact seemed to get lost as critics scrambled to laud glam rock, punk rock, grunge rock, indie rock, whatever rock, in the decades that followed. It has been 38 years since Michael Bloomfield died of an overdose, a period slightly longer than the duration of the guitarist's short life. For many decades, he was American pop music's forgotten man. But in recent years, that condition has shown signs of a correction. Authors Jan Mark Walken and Bill Keenum sparked renewed interest in Bloomfield when they published their fine oral biography, Michael Bloomfield, If You Love These Blues, in 2000. A decade later, Gibson introduced the Michael Bloomfield 1959 Les Paul Standard, a signature model created by their custom shop. And suddenly, contemporary guitar players were seeking out Bloomfield's recordings and rediscovering his extraordinary virtuosity. With the release in 2014 of Michael Bloomfield, From His Head to His Heart to His Hands, Sony Legacy's box set tribute to Michael, many new listeners could hear that virtuosity for themselves. And now comes this biography. The story of Michael Bloomfield's life is a fascinating tale of musical genius and artistic innovation, a saga punctuated by unorthodox adventures and wild excesses. Its arc parallels a time in American history when pop culture was undergoing a radical change, when politics, drugs, sex, and rock and roll were growing up. Bloomfield grew with them and contributed to their maturation. His musical ideas, coupled with his extraordinary personality and boundless energy, proved to be irresistible for a generation of young musicians. Certainly, they were for Bob Dylan. So it seems that Michael Bloomfield's time may finally be at hand, a time when he'll assume his rightful place among those guitar players whose artistry has shaped the evolution of American popular music and culture. About time, I say. And it's my sincere hope that this volume will in some way contribute to that worthy eventuality. Part 1. Guitar King. Chapter 1. Social Misfit. Chicago and Glencoe, 1943 to 1958. In 1958, the verdant bedroom community of Glencoe, Illinois, was an ideal repository for the American dream. A wealthy village on Chicago's North Shore, it was home to successful professionals who had escaped the growing urban blight of the big city to the south. Glencoe's stately homes with expansive lawns, tree-lined streets, excellent schools, charming shops, and country club exclusivity were a magnet for the Windy City's upwardly mobile. Families with means invariably decamped to the North Shore, and Glencoe was a favored destination. Sheridan Road was the village's main residential thoroughfare. 1 block west, and 3 blocks from the sandy beaches of Lake Michigan, lay Greenleaf Avenue. A quiet lane of suburban domesticity, the street was flanked by landscaped manses set at a tasteful distance from the curb, and from one another. One, a 6-bedroom house in the Spanish style, occupied a manicured corner lot at the north end of the street. It was home to a family recently arrived from Chicago's North Side, a husband and wife, and their 2 adolescent sons. Harold and Dorothy Bloomfield were an attractive couple, and they easily fit the village's ideal demographic. Their boys, Michael Bernard, born on July 28, 1943, and Alan, born 18 months later, were typical American adolescents, bright and engaging. They attended the local secondary school and, with their parents, regularly worshipped at North Shore Congregation Israel, the village's Reform Temple. In all respects, the Bloomfields were a conventional, well-to-do Glencoe family. In all respects, that is, except one. The couple's elder son, 14-year-old Michael Bloomfield, had developed a passion for music. Like many teens his age, he was enthralled by the new sounds he was hearing on the radio, music the newspapers were calling rock and roll. He was a big fan of Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Gene Vincent. The star singer from Memphis, Elvis Presley, was a particular favorite. But Michael's musical tastes weren't limited to the current hit parade. In that way, he was different from the other kids in Glencoe. Michael Bloomfield was obsessed with the blues. It was music he had first heard under the covers at night, music he secretly tuned in on a pocket transistor radio he had been given as a bar mitzvah gift. That same year, his 13th, he talked his parents into buying him a guitar, largely because his cousin had been given one. Lessons with Tony Tenalia, his mother's hairdresser, followed, and soon young Michael was spending hours alone in his room, practicing chords and running scales with an enthusiasm he rarely exhibited for his schoolwork. Though he was left-handed, he never bothered to restring his harmony to accommodate his natural preference. He simply forced himself to learn right-handed. Even so, it wasn't long before he was picking out the guitar parts to his favorite rock and roll songs. That was 2 years earlier. Since that time, Michael had purchased a real guitar, a Gibson ES-175, an archtop electric with 2 pickups, and a heavy amplifier to plug it into. He had become proficient enough on the big instrument to begin playing in public, comping along as part of an adult accordion quartet, or running down raucous rock and roll licks with other teens at weekend beer parties at an abandoned shopping center in neighboring Wilmette. He would play with anybody, and he would play anything. But what he wanted to play most was blues. Not that he really understood what the blues were. He heard songs at night on his transistor radio that DJs described as blues, songs that were regularly featured on stations like WDIA out of Memphis or on Nashville's WKDA. He heard some of those same tunes during the day as the family's live-in housekeeper, an African-American woman named Mary Williams, went about her duties. When her employers were not at home, Mary tuned in to WGES and WVON, stations broadcasting from Chicago's South Side, and passed the time listening to the latest releases by Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf. Michael soon learned their names and the names of other blues musicians, players with exotic-sounding monikers like Lightnin' Hopkins and T-Bone Walker. He began searching for their records and trying to learn the guitar parts to their tunes. Over those same stations, Michael also heard ads for clubs that featured bluesmen. With Mary Williams's help, he had even gotten into one venue north of the Loop, a folk club called the Gate of Horn, to see the legendary Josh White. He had met the blues singer before the show and had been thrilled by his performance. It was an experience that convinced the young guitarist that he had to see some of Chicago's other blues stars. But that meant he would have to travel deep into the city's black ghetto, the South Side neighborhood that ran along the lake from Roosevelt Road to 63rd Street, a stretch known as Bronzeville. It was a part of Chicago that few whites would ever think of visiting, and it was certainly no place for a suburban teenager. But Michael was determined to go, even though he knew his parents, especially his father, would disapprove. It wasn't that Harold Bloomfield was averse to taking risks. As a highly successful businessman, he understood that necessity. His father, Samuel Bloomfield, had given him a gas station to manage when he was only 14, and now, at 44, he ran the production side of one of the fastest-growing hotel and restaurant supply companies in the country. Bloomfield Industries, started in 1933 as a purveyor of dessert display cases for diners and roadside eateries by the elder Bloomfield, had grown under Harold's guidance in partnership with his brother, Daniel, into a multi-million-dollar company occupying 6 acres of Archer Heights, a southwest Chicago neighborhood near suburban Cicero, and employing nearly 1,000 workers. Michael Bloomfield's father was nothing if not a risk-taker. But Harold strongly disapproved of his elder son's obsession with music. He was a consummate businessman, driven by personal discipline and a determination to succeed, and he devoted nearly all his waking hours to that objective. That Michael could spend entire days in his room listening to music, if that noise could even be called music, while playing along on a buzzy, loud electric guitar was alarming. Time that should have been devoted to schoolwork was instead squandered on a frivolous hobby. Mr. Bloomfield could see no future in rock and roll for his son. In his eyes, Michael was destined to join him in the family business, just as he had done with his father. The boy would be a businessman like the Bloomfield men before him. But Michael Bloomfield had no interest in business. He had found something he was good at, playing guitar, and had discovered a world of sound in rock and roll, R&B, and blues, especially blues, that excited him like nothing else. He had to know more about it, and about its creators. Many of them lived and worked in the vast metropolis just 20 miles to the south. Why couldn't he go see them? Michael had been listening to the big stars of Chicago blues on the radio for many months, and now he decided he would go see the biggest. He would go see Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters in 1958 was Chicago blues royalty, a string of hits for the city's chess label beginning in the late 1940s had made the 44-year-old Mississippi native famous. Tunes such as Rollin' and Tumblin', I'm Your Hoochie Coochie Man, and I'm Ready had become blues standards by the middle of the decade, and Got My Mojo Working, Muddy's latest single, was the current favorite on many of Chicago's R&B radio stations. Waters had a regular Thursday night gig at Johnny Pepper's Modest Club on 43rd Street, 6 blocks east of the 43rd Street L stop. Called Pepper's Lounge, the joint provided setups for its customers and charged 35 cents at the door. Pepper's was not exactly a place one would expect to find a 14-year-old white boy from the suburbs. But one Thursday after school, Michael caught a bus on Green Bay Road. With him was his closest friend, a schoolmate named Roy Ruby, whose stepfather was a professor of logic at Chicago's Roosevelt University. A bright, inquisitive teenager who fancied himself a poet, Roy, too, had gotten caught up in the blues. He had no qualms about joining Michael in his unprecedented sojourn, and the two boys rode the bus through the villages of Winnetka, Kenilworth, Wilmette, and Evanston, then on into Chicago, where they switched to an L train at the line's northernmost terminus at Howard Street. From there they rode down through the city's north side neighborhoods, descending into the subway tunnel after the Fullerton Parkway stop for the ride into the Loop. Even though rush hour was nearly over, the subway's downtown platforms were still crowded with commuters. There were businessmen in heavy overcoats, their hats pulled down against the city's notorious wind, shopgirls checking their makeup one last time in a vending machine mirror, day laborers with tool belts and lunch pails, and book-laden school kids heading home from after-school programs. It was a cross-section of Chicago's diversity, a healthy mix of race, gender, and age, all waiting for the next train. With each station stop, Michael and Roy were buffeted as passengers pressed in through the open car doors. They shared a strap, swaying each time the train lurched forward and shifting their feet to keep their balance. The trip was beginning to feel like a real adventure, and they both were excited. When the cars pulled into the Jackson Boulevard station, many of the seated riders stood and most of the strap-hangers reached for the aisle poles. After a moment, the doors opened, and the commuters streamed out onto the platform. Most were transferring to the Cermak Road line, heading for the southwest side suburbs. But Michael and Roy stayed on the train and rode to Roosevelt Road. There they went upstairs to the L platform and switched to a Jackson Park train headed for Bronzeville. The car was comfortably empty compared to the Howard, and the boys slid into one of the vacant seats as the train picked up speed. Michael gazed drowsily out the window as signal lights flashed by, but Roy, glancing around, suddenly felt uneasy. He realized that he and Michael were the only white people in the car. The Jackson Park train passed by the lighted windows of apartment buildings and over cross streets, busy with evening traffic. When it reached the 43rd Street stop, the boys stepped out of the car into the cold night air and clambered down the platform steps to the darkened street below. It felt good to stretch their legs. The trip had taken the better part of 2 hours. Though they were strangers in a strange land, Michael and Roy found Pepper's without mishap. It was early yet, but there was already a crowd of people standing around the door, waiting to get in. Michael saw why. An old gent seated on a stool was taking money just inside the entrance. He was holding a silver chain across the doorway and letting in only one person at a time. Once he had the money in hand and had given the patron a visual once-over, he would drop the chain and allow him to pass. Then the process would begin again. Michael and Roy stood in line, waiting their turn. They hadn't attracted much attention beyond a few curious stares from people passing by on the street. But when they stood before the doorman, they suddenly struck out. "Where you boys think you're going?" asked the man on the stool, more than a little surprised. We're here to see Muddy Waters. We just want to see the band," stammered Michael. "Muddy Waters?" barked the doorman. "How old are you, boy? Your mama know where you are? Go on now, you boys better move on away from here." Some in the crowd began to laugh. "What they doing here?" one man said. "Probably looking for some brown sugar," said another, inspiring snickers. Roy suddenly felt uncomfortable again. What were they doing there? But Michael was undeterred. He could see there was no point in arguing with the doorman. They were not going to get in. But he could hear the band tuning up inside Pepper's, and the young guitarist grabbed his friend's arm. The teenagers moved over to the adjacent storefront and listened. Soon they heard Muddy being introduced, and then the band launched into 40 Days and 40 Nights. Muddy's amplified voice boomed out over the driving sound of bass and drums, while the piercing keen of his slide guitar rattled the club's big plate glass windows. In the spaces between the words cascaded the notes of a piano. Mike knew that had to be Otis Spann. He was absolutely thrilled. The boys spent the better part of an hour outside of Pepper's, transfixed, listening to the great Muddy Waters perform and catching glimpses of the band through the few unpainted portions of the storefront window. They wouldn't get home until after midnight, and they hadn't gotten into the club to actually see the star bluesman. But the trip was a success anyway, and Michael knew he would be back. Michael Bloomfield's early years were spent in Chicago. He had been born in the city and lived with his family in a high-rise apartment building on Melrose Street, a few quiet residential blocks on the city's north side. He attended the Nettlehorst School around the corner, and his days were filled with childhood pleasures: Duncan yo-yo demonstrations at ABC Toyland, frolics in Lake Michigan at nearby Montrose Beach, the latest Hollywood Western at the Diversey Theater, trick-or-treating in homemade costumes, walking to and from school with classmates. Michael was an integral part of life in the neighborhood, and had a deep enthusiasm for Chicago's many attractions. He was a real city kid. But then, in the middle of Michael's 6th grade year, the Bloomfields abruptly moved. Dorothy, known in the family as Dottie, decided her boys would receive a better education in the North Shore's prestigious schools. Harold agreed, but had his own reasons for relocating. His brother and business partner, Daniel, had recently built a grand house in the suburbs, becoming the first member of the Bloomfield family to own his own home. Unwilling to be outdone, Harold also decided to move north. Because his brother had selected Glencoe for his family's new address, Harold did too. Thus, in the spring of 1955, young Michael Bloomfield found himself transplanted to the woodsy bowers and shady lanes of suburbia. The change was disorienting. In their new school, it quickly became apparent that the Bloomfield boys were social outsiders. The prosperous North Shore had
Sample complete. Ready to continue?